All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of Afterlife Apologetics. For those of you who are new here, we talk about deathbed visions, near death experiences, and how these all relate to worldviews like Christianity and other faiths. And so, our ultimate desire for you here, listener, our dear, dear listener, our ultimate desire for you is to come in here and learn some truth. We want to engage you in thoughtful dialogue and thoughtful discussion, show you the evidence, and walk out some of these principles or arguments in a way that helps you guys understand them and arms you with the information you need to make, let's say, informed decisions about what the grand emphasis or the implications of this is. So, and our hope is ultimately to bring you to the truth of Christianity, which we believe to be the true worldview. But of course, to also engage you in thoughtful dialogue and respect the fact that you may disagree. So that's the intro for those of you who may be new here. So welcome in. Now, quickly, we're going to talk about really last week. So last week we were talking about the importance and the appeal of afterlife apologetics specifically, and Dr. Miller and I were kind of sharing our different opinions on why we think this is such an important field to get out there and get into the hands of Christians, apologists, skeptics, anyone who's looking to question, both for the beautiful element of the stories, the personal nature of the stories, and of course, the intellectual rigorousness of it. I don't even know if rigorousness is a word, but it is now. So
Let's coin it.
it's our word now, rigorousness. Anyway, so that is basically what we were covering last week in that episode. So if you missed that, please go back, watch it. We definitely spend a lot of time debating the differences between intellectual and emotional balancing of information. So it's got to take into both of those accounts. But one thing we didn't get to, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the integration that this field will play in things like the moral argument, the historical argument for Christ, and several other different apologetics. It kind of really comes in and reinforces the positions of those arguments, and those arguments in and of themselves are extremely convincing in their own right. But many of our listeners may be more interested to the afterlife aspect of it, so we're going to tie it back. But today we're going to kind of bounce around. This is the fun part about it, is we don't get to talk both Dr. Miller and I have an interest in apologetics as a whole. So this will be fun for us today to kind of get to bounce around and talk about some of the different arguments, but how these all interweave into it. Anything to add to that, Steve?
I think that sounds good. Let's just jump right in.
All right, let's do it. So the first one I wanted to talk about was the historical argument for Christ. And for those who don't know, Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, I know for a fact are, well, I guess I don't know if J.P. Moreland's made this argument, but I know Habermas has for sure because I did in my degree, that near-death experiences provide great evidence for a supernatural realm. And so Habermas's point is that if near-death experiences confirm the supernatural, and that's all he needs them to do, then it seems reasonable to assume that, or extremely possible. I don't know if extremely is the word here. I'm being too particular. I'm sorry. If it's possible that God exists, and therefore it's possible that miracles can exist, and therefore it was possible that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so I'm sorry, Gary, if I just butchered that. But basically, he makes the argument that near death experiences can be used as evidence for the supernatural. If the supernatural exists, there's no reason to say that God couldn't raise someone from the dead. That's more or less it in a nutshell. Anything to add to that, Steve?
Well, I'd say let's go back to the 17 and 1800s when you had a lot of skeptical scholars that began studying the New Testament as if it was a purely, and the Old Testament as if they were purely naturalistic documents. And it seems to me in studying these guys that they start off with a presupposition that we're in a scientific age. We can't believe in miracles and demons and angels and this whole world view of the New Testament and Old Testament. So let's go back and see historically what really happened. So if you take out all the miracles, then you start saying, okay, well, I guess these documents had to have been written later in the second century for the New Testament. They couldn't have been written as eyewitness accounts in the first century. And so that's when they started destroying the New Testament by saying, well, when we look at it, these are not really accurate history. They were written with a whole different worldview in mind. That and people like Rudolf Bultmann would later say
Mm.
that we just can't believe in this world of angels and demons and miracles anymore. We've got to rethink Christianity in naturalistic terms. So people trying to argue for the historicity of the New Testament had a problem in that a lot of historians said, well, we don't have any evidence that there are miracles. So even if we've got multiple sources testifying to Jesus' life, like the Gospels and the Apostle Paul, who was a contemporary of Jesus, and all this, well, we can't really believe them because they're talking about miracles, and we don't believe in those. So if they were wrong with the miracles, what else might they be wrong about? So it's extremely important, and I'm glad that Dr. Habermas goes back and deals with this and says, we do have evidence today that we should not have a bias against historical documents talking about the miraculous because we experience them today. So, and near death experiences, again, seem to be some type of miracle, however we define it. Let's think of it this way: signs and wonders in the Gospel of John. Wonders were things that you would not expect if it were a purely naturalistic event. So Jesus turns the water into wine, and it's like, oh, okay, well, wait a minute. This is a wonder because that everybody knows that doesn't just happen.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't just happen that somebody born blind is all of a sudden able to see. That's a wonder. But put it in the context of this was Jesus doing these works, it becomes a sign that, ooh, every time these things happen, Jesus is around. So it's a sign that God is involved. So, in the same way, I think that near death experiences are a wonder in the sense that this is not what you would expect. You would not expect, from a naturalistic perspective, for somebody to be outside of their body at a time of clinical death, telling exactly what went on during the resuscitation. So it's a wonder in that sense, but it's also a sign because in this experience, people are seeing deceased relatives on the other side. This is a sign, and they're also seeing God. They may call him a being of light, but whatever. He's a personal, intelligent force that's up there that's just like we define as God. And so it is a sign in the sense that it's pointing to something beyond. So signs and wonders, miracles, we've got evidence for them today, which keeps us from having a naturalistic bias against taking serious the historicity of the New Testament and Old Testament documents.
Steve, do you think that, and let's try not to digress too much on this, but I am curious. I think it's relevant. Do you think that that objection is unique to the 18th and 19th century of this naturalistic based objection that people don't die, there's no supernatural, the angels and demons, we just kind of got to do away with all this nonsense and start viewing the world in a more practical matter, a more scientific matter? Do you think that that's unique to that, or do you think that the that type of objection pre-existed that era and it was just manifested in some other form?
I think there have probably always been people who looked at the world and said, okay, back during Plato's time, Plato worried that people were starting to reject the gods. And I think societies always kind of went back and forth between whether they took religion seriously or didn't take it seriously. I mean, look at when Jesus went on trial. What is truth? Okay,
Hmm.
it was said to him during that trial. He said, "What is truth?" Okay, well, relativism is nothing new. It was a thing back then as well. Not believing in God or gods is probably always been around. But I think because of the advance of science in particularly in the 17 and 1800s, they started finding out so many cool things about the naturalistic universe. And to me, our minds have a tendency, we know this from um, studies of investing, that when a stock starts going up, our minds think that graph is going to continue to go up. And so we buy it when it's going up. And then we get scared when it starts dropping and we sell it. So we buy high and sell low, which is exactly the opposite. But our mind has this strong tendency to follow patterns. I think people in the 1800s, certain scientists got in their minds, ooh, science is finding out more and more and more. We're refining its methods. We've got all these divisions of science. Hey, eventually science is going to understand everything from a naturalistic perspective, especially in the 1800s, latter 1800s. Uh, this became very strong in a lot of segments of academia. And then in the 1900s, a lot of people were just looking back saying, hey, this is where we've come. Naturalism should be the default position. And it became much stronger than in a lot of periods of time. Now, still, people were seeing miracles. Still, people believed in God. Still, many scientists believed in God. But it just became a stronger force in science, I think, in the 1800s and 1900s.
Hmm. And so that would mean near-death experience evidence becomes more relevant during that time frame as proof of the supernatural.
Uh, yes, they should
You-
have been taking it into consideration. Now, deathbed experiences in the late 1800s, led by some of the top scholars at Cambridge University, um, that became that one of the reasons that they were motivated to study this was that we had this naturalism coming on so strong, materialism, and they were saying, hey, there's good evidence that materialism isn't explaining everything.
Mhm.
Here, look at these counterexamples, and let's look at 17,000 people and see what they're experiencing. And so it was important because of that, because they thought there's really no reason for materialism to take over as the default worldview.
Mhm.
There are all these experiences that people are ignoring. Let's look at them.
And so, with that approach, Dr. Habermas would then say, okay, now that we have this supernatural phenomenon confirmed by the dying and resurrecting, it seems completely reasonable then to say that since the best explanation of the empty tomb was Jesus rising from the dead, and the only presupposition that you could really I don't want to say the only presupposition, but the most popular presupposition that you would bring to the argument would be dead people don't rise from the dead, or Jesus wouldn't have rise from the dead, or they would have stole the body, or whatever. It's safe to say he's looking at it from, okay, you look at near-death experiences and you can use these phenomena to say supernatural realm exists, and therefore it's very much possible that God raised Jesus from the dead, which is the explanation that was given of the historical argument to begin with.
True. I think I'm with you on that.
So that kind of ties all the way back in to what we've been referring to this whole time of afterlife apologetics bolsters the argument for the historical resurrection of Christ. Because if you wanted to say something to the effect of, Jesus didn't rise from the dead for, let's say, naturalistic reasons, we're not going to look at like the swoon theory or anything like that right now. But let's say for naturalistic reasons, just simply that, if he was dead, he was dead, then Afterlife Apologetics seems to say no. We have extremely good reason to think that God exists, that the heaven and hell that's referenced not only in Christianity, by the way, it is referenced in many religions. They talk of a heaven, they talk of a hell. There's very much this dynamic, and so you couldn't just on the basis of naturalism just be like, nope, it doesn't work, or materialism, it doesn't work, Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead. It's like, no, there is very much a possibility that Jesus could have been risen from the dead. Matter of fact, it is the best explanation of all the historical evidence we have of this event, and therefore you have good reason to believe that Jesus raised from the dead and that the disciples are telling the truth.
That's true. And I think we should also bring in it's not just that, okay, the resurrection is now a possibility on the table if miracles do exist, but we need to deal with this question of plausibility. I think for a
Mm,
lot of
yeah.
historians that are naturalistic, they're saying, okay, well, even if even if it might, okay, let's say there is a God, let's say it's possible, it's still just not plausible because these miracles are just so rare that
Hmm.
we just can't assume they're going to happen. Or we can't. So we're going to call any literature into question that has some miracle in it, not because we disbelieve in miracles, maybe they are, but they're just so rare that it's just not plausible to believe in something like the resurrection. And so they just kind of sneer at things like that and sometimes don't even consider the evidence of the historicity of such events. Now, I'd go back to David Hume, who was a very, very influential um, philosopher. He had a book in which one chapter or one section of it was called Of Miracles. And I still have my students read that section because it's still people who argue against miracles today will quote from David Hume. And so one of the things he said was that science has come along and we've found these natural laws. And this is just everywhere we look, we see there's this law, that that there's a naturalistic explanation thing for things. There's gravity. If somebody comes up and says, "Oh, I walked outside and just floated straight up," you'd say, "Well, no, you didn't." And you said, "No, I've got good evidence. I've got friends who will testify." And you say, "I don't care how many people testify. We've got huge evidence over and over and over that gravity exists and that it works. So I don't care how many witnesses you have, I'm not going to believe it." And so he says, Hume would say, you know, these reports of miracles come from ignorant times, uh, ignorant places, and societies. And we just shouldn't believe them. We don't have enough evidence that they ever happened. They did happen. It was so rare. But we got natural laws. Believe the laws. People don't rise from the dead. Look around. Everybody dies. They
Mhm.
don't rise from the dead. So even if you've got witnesses saying that this happened, what should you believe? Well, you should believe this great majority that millions and millions of people all die and don't raise from the dead. One claims and says, "No, no, I've got good testimony." Well, obviously, question the testimony. What are the odds? The odds are totally against something like a resurrection happening. Now, the shortcoming, or many shortcomings, you ought to read a person who wrote Hume's Abject Failure. He was an agnostic, respected contemporary philosopher who wrote Hume's Abject Failure and showed the shortcomings of his arguments. But one of the shortcomings coming from near-death experiences is this is 4% of the population experiencing this. This is over 80% of the dying experiencing deathbed experiences. If these are truly, as we've argued, a subset of miracles, we've got a huge proportion of of um, today's testimony, today's people testifying that they've been to the other side. So you can't say that this is some kind of niche anomalous thing, as Hume was arguing. This is practically intrinsic to dying. 4%, that's millions of Americans. And again, ignorant times, ignorant places. These are studies that have been done in England and the United States and the Netherlands and France. We've got all these going on in some of the top most scientific societies today. So once we destroy Hume's argument and say, no, no, miracles are not just something tucked away in ignorant societies, these are things that are happening every day to people today.
Mm.
People that are smart people, people who are scientific people, and they're testifying to these things. So we can't ignore it anymore. And we can't just dismiss a resurrection because it's not a normal event.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that that gives us a safe. Uh, well, we never made the distinction. I wanted you to make the distinction, Steve, for the audience of possibility, probability, because I know you were kind of explaining that, but give us a succinct. This is possibility, this is probability. This is the difference.
Sure. So, possibility, many people were saying we're not going to accept any miracles in the past because it's just impossible for miracles to happen. And that's in part what Hume was arguing, that it's just we've got natural laws that explain everything. And so even if there were a thousand witnesses, we just shouldn't believe it because we've got 10 million witnesses saying people don't rise from the dead. So that would be an impossibility. But I believe once people get over that and they say, well, there may be a God. In fact, I see evidence of miracles all around. Then you begin to say, okay, then now it's possible. And then if you have for Jesus to rise from the dead and for Jesus to have worked these miracles, and in fact, if you had enough sufficient number of testifiers and people who are testifying under very difficult situations, for example, that they were at risk of dying should they testify openly about Jesus, and yet they did testify, then it can become a matter of probability once we begin weighing the evidence for the resurrection happening. Does that
Okay.
get where you're going? Where do you want to
Yeah,
go?
yeah. Well, I'm gonna give a really quick example so that this makes sense to people. So possibility is I buy a lottery ticket. It's possible for me to win. Probability is you buy a lottery ticket. You're probably not going to win. The numbers are probably not going to come out in your favor. Um, whereas one thing I wanted to note was you said that we have reliable testimony and that these people are dying for this testimony. Whereas the pushback to that, Steve, would be, and we're doing a little bit of apologetics here, folks. We're talking a little bit about the historical resurrection at this point. That would be, well, what's to say that people die for things that are not true all the time. So what makes it any different for these people and their testimony? Yeah, I mean, sure, you've established, okay, fine. You've established the possibility of Jesus's resurrection, but you still haven't convinced me of its probability.
Right. Well, I would consider Marxism and communism. Me personally, from my study of these issues, I would consider Marxism and communism lies. I don't think they mesh with reality, and yet many people have died for that. Does that make their testimony correct? Well, the difference when you're looking at the disciples, and so many of them at least lived horrid lives trying to testify to Jesus. Um, thrown in jail time after time after time. Uh, the difference between them and the people that died for communism is the people who died for communism thought it was the truth. But if the disciples, being eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, if they had known that he really did not work those miracles, if they had known he really did not rise from the dead, then they were dying not just for something that was a lie, but they were dying for something that they knew was a lie. That
Mm.
puts them in a different category from the others. Now,
Yeah.
again, these are things that huge books of 800 and 1,000 pages have been written on where you have to weigh through this. We're making a lot of assumptions, but this is not, we're not trying to argue fully for the resurrection here. We're just saying when it comes to the miraculous, this you do need to deal with the presupposition as to whether miracles are possible and even probable in certain circumstances.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, like Steve said, this isn't a robust argument for the resurrection. There are great, Dr. Habermas is the foremost world expert on this. So go read. I know he just released a like 1,000-page tome on the evidence for the resurrection for those to consider. But basically, the point Steve was making was people don't die for something they know to be a lie. I remember listening to an interview. I don't know if it was an interview or just a conversation with J. Warner Wallace, and he was saying that he had done a lot of work on conspiracies since he was a private investigator. No, excuse me, he wasn't a private investigator. He was a detective, and in his detective
Cold
work,
case detective.
yeah,
Yep.
cold case detective, and so he was very much in the business of identifying people, holding on to a lie for 15, 20 years and basically this committing this conspiracy together. And he was talking about how challenging it was to get a conspiracy past 2 or 3 people. Like, he's like, once you go past that and the conspiracy's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, he's like, every person you add into the circle of the conspiracy dramatically increases the rate at which the conspiracy will become exposed. And so when applying that to the resurrection, you have so many people who very well could have been like, it was all a lie. I was there. It was all a lie. But we don't have a single one of those. And that's what he points out is so powerful that it doesn't stand up to the scrutiny that conspiracy falls under. Normally conspiracy falls under that. And so he mentions that in terms of people don't like to die or suffer for something they know to be a falsehood. People do not like that. Now, people will die all the time for something they believe to be true. But if they know it to be a lie, when it comes to putting your life on the line or your resources on the line, your well-being, your image, it is really challenging to give all that up and just allow that lie to overcome your entire life. Now, you may argue in some situations where someone could pull that off. Absolutely. Maybe a father does it for the well-being of a son. But I don't think you could argue that a group of followers as large as the disciples and then the immediate aftermath of people who supposedly saw Jesus alive, that all of these people would be then willing to go off and then die for something they knew to be false, because these are people who claim to have firsthand knowledge of Jesus. Either they saw him, spoke to him, whatever. These are people who knew that this was what was going on, and the church spent its first 250, 300 years persecuted. So it was going to cost you if you committed to this perspective. Now, of course, after that, you'll have people who are going to die for things they think that are true. And that's where people would be like, well, what about Muslims? They believe all this to be true, and so on and so forth. And it's like, yeah, people die all the time for things they believe to be true. But people usually, we'll say virtually always, don't die for something they know to be a lie.
When I was taking care of Mom in her last couple of years, uh, uh, we would I would watch some TV shows with her. I don't watch a lot of TV, but we saw an old episode of, I believe it was Gunsmoke. Wasn't it Gunsmoke? And you had Marshall Dillon, and Marshall Dillon was out trying to get the truth about who murdered somebody. And there was this person who was dying who gave his dying testimony about what happened. And and deathbed testimony is kind of a special thing in legal evidence, because Marshall Dillon, he made this statement. He said, something like this: death has a way of scaring the truth out of people.
Mm.
Because I mean, if you know you're dying, or you know you're liable to die, you're not gonna. Your number one thing is not, oh, let's see if I can pull one over on people and tell one more lie before I die. Typically, they don't have anything to lose, and these people were always being confronted with the possibility of death. Why did they hold on to it? Why didn't Peter at some point just change and say, forget it? I mean, this is too difficult. I'm going back to fishing. Fishing's fun
Mm.
as well as a good occupation. Go back to that, okay? Have a good life. Don't stir up the Roman government. What chance do you have against that? It's
Mm.
like the evil empire. Yeah,
You will
this
have
little
no
group of
chance.
rebels. Oh, and we're getting into Star Wars here.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we've done justice to that kind of conversation. Of course, definitely, if you guys want to check out more of the resurrection, the historical argument for the resurrection, we highly recommend going and getting Gabermas or Mike Lycona's works, and they'll take you in the right direction. But we're simply just saying, hey, Afterlife Apologetics substantially bolsters the position of the supernatural existing, and therefore miracles are completely on the table. And so the idea that Jesus rose from the dead is completely probable when considering the evidence.
And talking about convergence with areas of apologetics. Let's say that you're dealing with the cosmological argument or the fine tuning of the universe. These only get us so far in our apologetic. You're talking about evidence that there is a very smart and a very powerful God that must have created the world and created it with these incredibly improbable settings, according to naturalism. So that's cool, but it only gets us so far. You got a very smart, you got a very intelligent, very powerful God.
Mm.
But near death and deathbed experiences take us further. They get us into a God
Mm.
who is just. Nobody comes back from the other side saying, oh, God was so unjust in his ways. And in fact, let me just read this one experience. Someone said, in their near death experience, I was immersed in a feeling of total love. It was crystal clear to me why I had cancer. Okay, we're getting into the problem of evil here, right? People blame their cancer, blame the death of their loved ones on an evil God or whatever. We're dealing with the problem of evil. In this testimony, it was crystal clear to me why I'd had cancer, why I'd come into this world in the first place, what role each of my family members played in my life, where we all were within the grand scheme of things, and in general, what life is all about. The clarity and insight I had in that state are simply indescribable. Words seem to diminish the experience. I was in a place where I understood that there's so much more than we can fathom in our three-dimensional world. It looks to me like the problem of evil was solved for this person by going to the other side. Now, when they come back, they may not remember the specifics of, okay, how all this was so important that they were born into this family, or why I had cancer or something. But they know when they were on the other side, it all made sense why everything was happening. That solved the problem of evil. That solved the problem of, is God a just God for them? Another patient of Dr. Van Lommel. These are not just things pulled off the internet, but these wasn't pulled off the interstate either. I don't think. I don't remember this person's situation. Maybe they were. But this person in Dr. Van Lommel's study said, I've acquired a great sense of justice. I've become more patient and peaceful. I can see things in perspective now. My aggression is a thing of the past. I feel a strong inner urge to never lie again. I'd rather keep silent than tell a little white lie. So morals come into strong um, strong relief because of these experiences, and it's life changing. Now, people may believe in God because of the ontological argument, but I'm not sure how life changing it is. Maybe it is, but in near death experiences, something that adds to our apologetic is, it in itself is life changing. 5 years later, Van Lommel interviews them. Their life's different. Some of them have changed vocations to go into something where they're serving. Um, they still have this vivid memory of what happened, and it's changed their lives. I think this is a very powerful apologetic.
Steve? Why do we always have to pick on the ontological argument? We're always picking on that guy.
Because neither of us get it. I'm sorry. Maybe we're just not smart enough. It just
Seems that way.
always seems to be that somewhere in the ontological argument, they've made a bad move from what is real in my mind to what is real in reality. There's
Mm-mm.
just some false move there but maybe I'm just not a good enough philosopher
Mm.
um, to understand it.
Yeah. So let's get back on topic here with the moral argument. So Steve has kind of started to hint at this moral argument, which it, the problem of evil is a part of it. I would say that's a sub-discipline of it, in the sense that most people have a problem when you talk about this all-loving God who just wants the well-being for you, wants the best for you, wants the best for this world. You look at that, and then you look at Earth, and you go, there's hurricanes, there's disease, there's kids with cancer, there's abortion, there's human trafficking, there's all these terrible things that are going on in the world. How can this God be so loving and yet have all of these terrible things occurring in his reality, his kingdom? According to the Bible, it's his kingdom, and it doesn't seem like he's managing his kingdom very well from that perspective. And so Afterlife Apologetics sheds this incredible light on people who've had incredibly terrible circumstances occur to them, go into these near death experiences, and have those experiences provide new perspective on these experiences and what God was using them for. And it seems to me they have a clear connection of God allowed it to happen, not that God wanted it to happen, but that God allowed it to happen and was going to use it to some greater means. And they understood that, and they come back universally, it seems, with this understanding of, like Steve mentioned, one of the transformations that they have is a sense of justice, which is very important, because justice points out, yes, we understand that there's evil in the world, but we do not repay evil with evil, right? And that is a critical piece. If that's the cycle of revenge killings. But anyway, I'm digressing here. So the point is, Afterlife Apologetics shines a very powerful personal, I want to point that out, very personal light on this idea that God has good reason for allowing a world where these negative things can exist. God has good reason for permitting this reality in such a way that it would be in our overall interest that it is the way it is. So is, in a sense, the objective good that God's going to accomplish through all of this will far and above outweigh the evil. And I also want to point out one more thing, Steve, before you come in. I know you want to bite at this, but one more thing I want to point out is that near-death experiences confirm eternity. And therefore, it doesn't matter what segment of evil can be done to you in this tiny, tiny fragment of time when God can overwhelmingly make up for it in the long term. In a sense of
Yeah,
like,
in fact,
yeah,
one person in their near-death experience said, when I got over there and I saw what all God had for me, it just made the trials that I experienced in this life so insignificant in comparison. And so I think probably any philosopher, secular, atheist, or whatever, would say, hey, yeah, it's possible that God has allowed all of this bad stuff to happen for a good overall purpose.
mm-hmm,
But what is the probability of it? Well,
mm-hmm,
we would say, well, it makes it more probable if you believe that Jesus really came down here, that that was God in the flesh, and that he was doing all this for us, that he died for us, that he proved his love for us. But I'd say additionally, another form of evidence that makes it more plausible that God is good and just is that people have been over the other side and met God.
mm-hmm.
Their eyes were opened up to where they could see things clearly, much as he sees them now. And they came back and said, I've met God. He's not bad. All this does make sense, which I think adds to our dealing with the ability to deal with the problem of evil and to believe in a good God, even though we see a lot of problems here on earth.
Yeah, and I think that that's what's really interesting is that the problem of evil intellectually seems relatively easy to answer, and I don't mean to be, I don't mean to sound arrogant in that regard. I mean to say that it makes sense to me that if I was to say, okay, intellectually speaking, God has sufficient reasons for allowing evil to happen, right? That makes sense to me, okay? But that doesn't change the feeling I have when I see a 4-year-old with terminal cancer. And so that to me is where Afterlife Apologetics again has this powerful capability to appeal to us on that personal level of saying, look, here are personal accounts, personal interactions with God that people have had in there, and they've had cancer, they've had I can remember one lady was raped as a child, and God shows them the grand scheme of things. You know, it's like, what's the old saying? It's like you're over there playing checkers and I'm over here playing chess, which kind of alludes to the fact that it's like we're not on the same playing field. I'm making 3D moves and you're making 2D moves. And so it's like God's playing, you know, some divine version of chess that's, you know, got way more moves on the board than we can see. And to give you an illustration, I can think about all the time I hear this example, and it's a good one, of children think their parents are constantly doing things to them that are mean, might even, according to the child, be deemed as outright evil. But that's because the child doesn't have all of the information to understand why the parent's making the decision. I hated the dentist, and this is the most practical example I hear all the time of, you know, if I take my daughter to go to the dentist and we have to get her teeth drilled, that is going to be a miserable experience for her. But it's because I know that I would rather go through that than go through this alternate possibility of, well, then her teeth are just going to rot out, and then her roots are going to go bad, and then all kinds of terrible stuff start to happen. Way more pain on this track. Now, of course, you could make the argument that, well, God could just heal the teeth and no one would have the problem. But I think C.S. Lewis answers this really well in his book, The Problem of Pain, that I don't think it's possible where God creates a universe where people freely choose to always do good. And that's the universe you're saying would have to be created, is one where people both have free will and that they always exercise this free will in a manner that's deemed positive. I don't think that exists. I think you'll always have people, no matter how much free will you give, or rather when you give free will, that you're going to have some choose the bad just for the sake of that, just to be rebels, just to do I know people who will choose bad things just to spite someone else, knowing it's going to hurt them. It's not a logical thing. There's an emotional aspect to humanity that influences us and motivates us to do things, sometimes just out of pride and spite and ego. It has nothing to do with logic. So that's why I think it's the philosophical argument of, well, God could have created a universe where everyone freely chose to do good. I'm with C.S. Lewis. I think that that's a ridiculous idea. I don't think that it was at all possible or an option on the table. So all this to say, that I think near-death experiences and deathbed visions confirm that God is a very good and loving God, and that even though he allows evil in this world because he allowed a greater good, which is free will, he's able to accomplish much greater goods because of it, and that we will reap
Okay,
the
and
benefits.
let me go back to your illustration of taking your daughter to the dentist, and she's probably thinking, "Wow, my parents may hate me. Well, I wonder why they took me to the dentist, and I went through all this pain." The ultimate thing, wouldn't it be wonderful if all of a sudden you could just put your hands on your daughter's head, have a little mind meld, and
Mm,
she sees life from your perspective. And
mm,
then she says, "Okay, I still hate the dentist, but I love my
right.
dad because now I've got it." Well, that's exactly what's happened in a near death experience. Somebody was saying, "Why did I have cancer? Why did I have this? Why did I grow up in this crazy family? Whatever happened." But then says, "Okay, let me take you over to the other side for just a minute and let me open up your mind." And then they say, "Okay, God's good, God's just."
Mm-hmm.
And so it helps us with the problem of evil, especially those who've had such an experience. But if we have good evidence that people have actually gone there, that can help the rest of us as well.
I'm gonna steal that, Steve. I like that. I could put
Steal
my
that. Put it in your book.
put
Mine's
the
already through, but you can put it in yours.
put the hands on the head and mind
Yeah,
meld.
there you go.
That's cool. Well, do you think that there's anything else we should cover in regards to the moral aspect? Oh, or actually, I do have one more thing I want to bring up, Stephen, and then you can kind of jump in there if you have something else. But I wanted to talk about um, the justice aspect. I think that's a really powerful component that people come back with a stronger sense of justice. And it's interesting because it's like they don't come back and become Batman, but they come back and have this understanding of there is truly right and there's truly wrong in the world. And they also have a sense of personal accountability in that they have been responsible for some of the truly wrong in the world. Now, what I think that this does is this confirms what I think people know intuitively is that there is objective morality. And this is really, really important. And I think people get this wrong all the time of saying, well, I can do good or I can know how to do good without Christianity. Absolutely. I don't think that's ever been the argument from honest Christian theologians' perspective. It's just that you need a foundation in which to ground objective morality. So it isn't just up to everybody's opinion. And I wrote a paper in college on this of how we have a uh, ontological necessity for justice. That's a big set of words there to just simply say that the only way justice can be done properly is if there is something more important than someone's free will to be exercised. And that would be something, for example, we put people in jail all the time and we violate their free will by doing so. And so in the paper, I make the argument that the only way that could be possible is that if we had morality, justice is the enforcement of morality. If we had a morality that was more important than people's will in their individualism, which is a really big thing to say in Western cultures, and I think that that is confirmed through near death experiences that people come back and they say, like they go through their life reviews and they're like, oh, I had some good, I had some bad, and God showed me the perspective of both sides of the equation. And then they have this sense of justice and they want to help these people and help these relationships. So I think it hammers home the point that there is objective morality and it is housed in a objective personal being, which I understand that is definitely a leap that I just made there. And we don't have time to go into that right now. But I would just say that I think that it does absolutely confirm that. Steve, anything to add?
Well, I think what we're saying is this whole thing of afterlife apologetics, near death and deathbed experiences. This needs to be unwrapped in the light of a lot of the problems and a lot of the evidences that we've dealt with through the years. It's got multiple applications that need to be tied in with the evidence. That's what we're saying. It kind of, I mean, should I go a little bit outside of just tying it in? But I think we've made that point
Yeah.
that
I think,
this has relevance to a lot of areas of apologetics, and we need to be using it.
yeah, we got a
Um,
couple more minutes. We can do that.
okay, well, let me just hit some other areas. Okay, so the overall theme of both last week and this week has been the benefits of afterlife apologetics. And I just want to hit again just how how appealing this is to so many people. We hit it a little bit last week, but even this week, I was dealing with a person who was formatting one of my books for Kindle ebook. He's in Serbia, uh, very good editor, and I thought, okay, well, this is so he's not he's editing the document for that particular program that's going to house my book. So, so he says, well, I usually don't comment to people on their books. He said, I'm just formatting it for Kindle. He said, but hey, I've done a lot of study on this, and
Hmm.
let's talk about it a little bit. And all of a
Oh,
sudden,
that's cool.
here's an open opportunity to talk to someone about their spiritual life. Somebody I've never met personally. I don't know the guy. Hey, I just hired him a couple of weeks ago. And here we are talking about our spiritual life. Why? This guy in Serbia has been fascinated with such experiences and has been studying them. And it's just over and over and over. I keep meeting people. One of my students, so I'm just starting classes this week at KSU, got 3 classes, a total of about 120 students in there. Only a few of them have emailed me, but one emailed me early and just said, hey, just want you to know, I was shocked when I got into and I saw that you had one of your books on near death experiences for free for us for a PDF. And I thought, hey, I saw an interview of you with Sean McDowell on near death experiences. So here's a person who's a college student. Nobody was paying him to go listen to this interview, but it was inherently interesting enough for him to go watch this interview on this. People are fascinated. With my first book on near death experiences, I got a review from an unlikely source. Anne Rice, who wrote Interview with a Vampire and a lot of other best selling novels, uh, she wrote an ecstatic review of my book, and she was saying, for years I've been studying these experiences, and it's just amazing. She said, I've read of Howard Storm, I've read of this person, I've read of this. People out there are very fascinated with that, and in fact, in current culture, you've got an episode of MacGyver that's got where MacGyver has a near-death experience. Grey's Anatomy, where the main character of that has a near-death experience, and later another person. Okay, I binge watched this with my wife. Okay, so I just admitting that about Grey's Anatomy. But another character in the show had a um, after death communication. And recently, there's a movie that confirmed that animals sometimes have near death experiences, which is Guardians of the Galaxy. Rocket
Humanoid animals.
Raccoon has, spoiler alert, Rocket Raccoon has a near death experience. Go watch the movie if you haven't yet, and you can see it right there. So, this is very fascinating to a large number of people. Why not grab something that's inherently interested? Hey, I'm going for a scan in a couple of hours. They saw a couple of nodules on my lungs years ago. Don't really expect anything bad, but my doctor said, we ought to follow up with another scan and see. One reason people are interested in near death and deathbed experiences? Because we're all going to die.
Hmm.
And we get regular reminders of that. The death rate in America is astounding. It's 100%. Unless Jesus raises us from the dead, which is a possibility, but maybe not a probability for, right now while we're on earth. So I think that this is extremely interesting to people. That is extremely relevant because we think about death. And
Hmm.
so that primes people for understanding it. I mean, there are lots of reasons, there are lots of benefits to this study. I mean, there's just all
I
kinds of things.
mean,
The,
s-
the data comes from respected researchers. So it's not just something we're
mm,
just philosophizing about without evidence. In fact, these have been studied so long that now there are review studies of all these studies. So if you want to skip going into all the studies like we did to study this stuff, you can look at the science of near-death experiences collected from medical journals, 2017. Handbook of Near-Death Experiences.
By Outwater.
Others that have written, they're summarizing past studies. So here's a benefit of it. If you want to get into this in depth, there are studies summarizing the studies. It crosses cultures. As again, Serbia. I can go to anywhere and they're studying this. They've done studies in Japan, studies in Korea. We have them all over. The ties with the Bible go deep, which means that if you're a pastor or if you're teaching a Bible study, you can tie in near-death and deathbed experiences, which, we've seen examples of them in the Bible, after-death communications, transfiguration. You can say, hey, this happens to people today.
Mm.
What do you think about these reports? And it ties into what your congregation or what your Bible study is thinking about. The data is empirical. It's not just a feely thing. They've seen, they've heard. For those who say, oh, I only believe what I can see and experience personally. Well, if you've had one, you've seen it, you've experienced it.
Mm.
But if you've not had one, that doesn't mean, if you only believe in what you can see, what you've seen and experienced, then your map of America is limited to those states that you've actually experienced. Your globe of the world is limited to those countries you've actually visited. But I think you actually believe in the other states. You believe in the other countries. Why? Because you've got sufficient and abundant testimony saying that they're there.
Mm.
Same thing with near-death and deathbed experiences. They're saying we've been to the other side. So, there are just many things that make this area of apologetics. We're not trying to take away from other areas of apologetics. I'm
No.
very glad that I've studied the resurrection, the historicity of the New Testament, the problem of evil. Really, we've dealt with it a little bit. You need to read books on that because it goes deep and we need to think it through. But this is just a wonderful area that we need to no longer ignore and start incorporating into our lives and our witness.
Mm. Yeah, I think that is an excellent note to finish on for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching today's episode, listening in. We have a great time doing this. Steve and I love hanging out and talking about this stuff. And we really appreciate anybody who takes the time to hear us out because we think it's really important. And, we're going to keep going until we're dead. And I think that's got to be the craziest statistic ever dropped on Afterlife Apologetics Podcast, that 100% of people die. I mean, just gonna put down, there you go.
Look it up.
Mike,
Look it up on Wikipedia.
Look
It's
it
there.
up. Look it up. All right. Well, we appreciate it, guys. We'll see you guys next week for the next episode of Afterlife Apologetics. God bless. Talk to you guys next.